Welcome to Renaissance Charge Videos. I'm Rick Friedrich, and today I want to introduce to you the Benitez Loving Paths Switches, as well as the proposed Carlos F. Benitez Historic Free Energy Loving Paths open source project. In doing that, I wish to draw your attention to two very relevant 1892-93 Tesla publications, which together with the Benitez patents give you everything you're looking for to generate electrical power. The terms Tesla switch and the Tesla hairpin circuit have been floating around alternative energy communities for years, without most people really understanding essentially what they are, and especially how to practically benefit from them. Just ask yourself this question. Of all the so-called experts on the subject of Tesla and free energy, who is actually using this technology, and safely, and demonstrating it in any practical way? Are the skeptics right? Or are the experts just trying to keep you occupied with endless information products? You have a right to ask those questions and be not fooled. I've talked about these things in past videos, and it doesn't matter to me if Tesla did or did not invent the Tesla hairpin circuit. There's no evidence that I know of that he invented the so-called Tesla switch. Tesla was one of many researchers who learned from each other and from those before them, just like you and me. What I want to do today, and in the months and years to come, is offer you practical information for free. I don't want to see you get lost in all the quantum physics nonsense, or confused by relativity absurdities, but rather to keep straightforward and empirical, and only trust those who do. I'm not setting myself as a role model, and I'm just beginning as a student just like you in these things. But I'm setting up a proper standard and method of research for the public to insist upon, and the end results of the system are to be: 1, that it's safe to use; 2, easy to make; 3, with stable results; 4, practical to use. This is my method and a system that I demand from those who are claiming to be experts. Are you going to let me have to do it, you experts? I'm just a backyard mechanic. I don't know any of these things. But I'll do it if nobody else wants to. This whole project here, open source, it's about time that somebody does this, and does it the right way. We'll see what I can do. So I wish to introduce today the Benitez Loving Paths Switches as a perfect example of achieving these goals in an open source manner. So that means nobody owns it. Well, it's already patented 100 years ago. So I believe that the pages of Carlos F. Benitez electrical generation patents, along with 2 of Tesla's papers from the 1890s, contain all the information anyone skilled in the art will need to accomplish these ends. In fact, almost all of the free energy claims over the last 150 or 145 years directly relate to these few documents. Daniel McFarland Cook may have had the first free energy patent in 1871 and demonstrated it in 1886 to the public, but some of the details were vague. We can call his idea the Cook switch, since we're using the Tesla switch, the Benitez switch. Let's call it the Cook switch. We can call him the grandfather of these processes, because he predates Tesla and the rest. Tesla learned such ideas and published his and other findings in such important papers as the 1892 Experiments with Alternate Currents of High Potential and High Frequency. And the link is on the page. And in 1893, the next year, on light and other high frequency phenomena at the Electrotherapy Museum. So these give a lot of useful information, these two papers, but it appears people have been lost in the details. They provide essential details about what is more clearly shown in the Benitez patents, which are the most practical illustration and set of instructions on how to actually use this technology during that time period. What I'm trying to show in all my videos over the last year is that most, if not all, of the existing systems produced over the last 145 years are more or less the same and essential processes that we need to understand to benefit from. Again, it is important not to fall for fancy theories just because they are popular. Quantum physics. Again, remember, those who insist upon such theories are no better off than you are in your research for energy independence. It is important to suspend your judgment on exactly how something can be or even works. Get that? I used to say it as a kid. Well, we don't know how electricity works, we just turn the switch on, right? We don't say, well, I'm only going to turn that switch on unless I know how it works, where it came from, and all that. The kid just turns it on, knows it's going to work, right? So we can't just do that in all this research, or we get nowhere. We stop at the first place. So we just have to carefully observe what actually takes place. So I work with people that are technicians and that repair things and work on things. They're not so worried about, well, is this possible or not? They see it work, they do it. And that's what we need to do in all this stuff. Not that we need to be cautious, we need to be cautious as well to not harm ourselves. So we don't just jump into something like I've said before. It needs to be safe. We need to know it's safe, protect ourselves in case we don't know it's safe. It's very important. These are all toy level stuff right here. So, but it still can negatively affect you if you don't know what you're doing. So now, this idea of not just dismissing something before you understand it, or jumping to conclusions about something before you actually experiment or see the actual phenomena. A perfect example of this, now don't get too riled up here with my example, but it's a very good example. So, take for example the infamous collapsing of the World Trade Center. The two towers, actually 3 towers. Actually, all the towers that eventually came down. Let's look at all of them. Most people assume either 2 planes brought them down, if you accept the government's conspiracy theory, and most others who disbelieve that truly incredible story, because they were built to withstand such impacts. Most people who disbelieve those government conspiracy will believe, because they were told by other experts, right, that the towers were brought down by what? Explosions in some form or another, right? Or they dropped the towers, whatever, they pulled them, right? This is what we're told. One or the other. Well, either the government's lying and the planes didn't bring them down, or the bombs did. We don't even think to question. We don't even think to look at the video. Look at it again, people. So we have an excellent example of a true expert and researcher calling us to take our eyes off the perpetrators and their motives and these tragic events to look at what actually happened to the buildings first. First, right? Dr. Judy Woods gives an excellent presentation of the actually admitted facts and let them speak for themselves, while at the same time telling us to suspend our judgment of the conclusions made prior to fully examining those facts. Now, it's not my point to bring this up to debate it, but merely as an illustration to show you how we are to approach these matters. If we have phenomena that appear regularly, well, before I get into that, going back again, just so that you understand what I'm saying. A couple of facts. Number one, look at the Bible. I'm not quoting verses here. Don't worry about it. The Bible that is on display in the World Trade Center right now. It's real paper, but it's covered in melted metal. Explain that to me, and then you can argue with me about those Judy Woods' observation of these particular facts about the World Trade Center. How can metal melt and paper not burn? And look at the cars that melted down far away from the World Trade Center during that day. The paper was still in them, unburnt. Maybe something else happened than what all the experts are telling us, except maybe one expert who is qualified to look at all those details. And ask yourself, like Peter Jennings did to George Stephanopoulos, where did it all go? Oh, we've been told that it's in the basement, in the lower parts. But when they went down there, they were still perfectly intact. There was no rubble anywhere. Dustification. So this is something, has nothing to do with who did it, what were their motives, but just simply what happened, as we all can look at the videos and see. Upright pieces of metal turn into dust in thin air. Chunks of a building fall, turn into dust before they reach the ground. How's that possible? Explain that to me. Something we can all look at. Unless, of course, those videos are all fake too. And there's a giant conspiracy that we can't know anything about really anything. So anyway, I'm being a little sarcastic here. My point is, even if I was wrong on all those statements, everybody can agree with, we have to remove ourselves from the equation, our preconceived ideas, our notions, and look at the facts. And we will never get anywhere unless we do, as a scientist or a researcher. Otherwise, we commit confirmation bias, and we go in to a study looking only for what we're interested in and ignore anything that contradicts. So, if we have phenomena that appear regularly, but which we cannot explain, then we can still accept it, even if it cannot fit into our theories of how things work. This is actually our life, if we are honest about everything. As a child, we know almost nothing and constantly learn. Then we may know a little more than our friends and think we have it all figured out. This is what so many arrogant ones do with all their degrees and accomplishments. But they have settled too early and have paid for and earned the dark walls they have built around themselves. We must never lose that sense of wonder of children in the midst of wonders of God's creation. We must not think that we have examined every slice of this universe and His ways. People try and put God in a box, right? And virtually arrest those who contradict their so-called scientific laws. But they are shown to be fools in the end. Anyone who makes themselves an end-all expert in these matters is but a fool who is not even a true student. They are arrogant and are trying to control you, just as they have been controlled in what they have come to believe. In their whole education system, they are taught from the earliest age to be prejudiced, to prejudge, to believe what they are told, and not even know how to think. Show me one person who has been taught from the earliest age how to think honestly, logically. I can think of some homeschoolers. In the public school, not a chance. So those of you in your degrees, tell me about your education. You know, I'm not saying people haven't realized that their education has been limited and work through that psychologically, trying to figure out, man, I got to start all over again. That's what I had to do. I'm not saying people can't be smart with degrees. They can be. But unless they realize what happened to them at the very beginning and throughout their whole education, for the most part, there are some good teachers out there. I remember my grade 8 teacher. She really challenged us. That's why I remember her. You know. Anyway. The truth is that we are all but students together and are made to help each other out and progress for the good of all. That's exactly how God made us. We are not here to control each other and to enslave each other and create classes of people in such ways. We are made to be alive, independent-minded, and yet to live and grow together in love and grow in truth and grace. So what is wrong in this research is that it's all backwards and mistaken, controlled, manipulated. So, let's introduce the Benitez Switches, and then go over the relevant Tesla papers to enlarge upon the processes illustrated. And I think I will get into a little demonstration right now of all my induction coils that work. Some of them don't. So what we have here, I've shown this several times, but not all of them, is some induction coils that I got off of eBay for a good price. And it's a hit and miss. Some of them don't work. For example, some of them, the wires are all corroded. may be able to fix them. Battery acid on these can leak over wires over time, as you can see evidently happen here. I don't think that's water damage, that's acid or whatever chemical in these dry cells. And I think most of these work. There's only this one and this one that don't. Got about 9 of them here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yes. So let's run this one right here. This is a nice little one. So these are all around 100 plus years old, maybe a little bit older. So we're going to run this in the what I'm going to call the Benitez Loving Paths Switch 7, which you'll see on the screen better than this. And what we're going to do is run the induction coil between the batteries. And the batteries are 2 in series for 24 volts. And we're at 25.3. And then 2 in parallel at 1172. So I'm going to turn this on right now. These have a nice little lever switch here. And these were medical devices at the time. You know, anything went back then. Even cocaine was good for you. Now, I'm not going to recommend these for continuous use. They have been used, at least the violet ray device and similar devices have been used to cure all sorts of things. I would be extremely cautious with that. I have used them successfully, but I would never recommend long-term use because there is no sufficient testing on that for long-term use. Not to mention, there's immediate exposures that you get into. So let's look at this. So again, we got our 10,000 watt light bulbs here. No, we're looking at about 1 watt, 2 watts at the most on those. I run, these have various differences in their primary coils, which will determine the actual amperage of the system. So you can see it's well lit up. The whole room is just spectacular here. Spectacular. Anyway, so we're running this. You can see the batteries are charging. I'm not going to try and prove all that. We've already looked at that over time. You can do it yourself. You can play with this. We'll look at the batteries under load. 24.9. Right? The amperage is like, I think, 500 milliamps. So over time these batteries charge while this one discharges. 24 volts charging, or powering. Now what can actually happen here is that we can actually charge both sets of batteries too with this system, which is fun. So let's look at this one more time. Oops. .9. You see it fluctuates a little bit on this one. 1262. And we turn it off. Now immediately this will go down. $12.06. It's under load or under rest. It was under load when I was doing it. And we got 25.1 and it's going back up. And we can do that with all of these induction coils here, which I will show here. Now this one I had a capacitor across it, and there's various ways to do that. And I had it exactly according to this paper here, where I ran the capacitor in between the negatives, where the negatives connect. The negatives connect here, and we're running the induction coil just like we do my motor between the two positives. So let's look at another one. We got plenty to work with here. I'm not sure, I don't remember if this one works or not. So you can see where the battery goes. There's one over there, a dry cell, that would fit into these. This one might not work, I'm not sure. Oh yeah. Sometimes I should have set this one up before. Oh well, not worth the time. Play with it right now. Alright, so let's look at another one. This one works. This is a nice one. And I can run it either way. So again, I'm going through the transformer. This one you can actually see the green, nice green spark. You can look at the voltages here. $14 volts up on this one. It's really getting up there. Let's see what this one is drawing. 24.7, of course. This one's drawing more, but it's charging more, of course. So yeah, we're at 1420. All right. Done with that one. We've already looked at that one. We've looked at that one. So you can see, I'll try two more here, just so we can say we've shown all of them. eBay is reliable for getting things from. Well, I had to fix a couple of these. So I think. There we go again. Nice greenish, bluish spark here. And we're at 1373 and climbing. And again, 24.7 under load. Now I want to try the big one. Very high. These ones are all low voltage. Fairly low voltage. And you can see this dry cell. This one actually works. I mean, it's not charged up or anything, and I haven't really played with it. It's kind of leaky. I got a couple of these that are gone, but that one still works. So let's look at this one now. And these were some ones that I got off of Amazon, and that maybe I might make a kit with them. They really don't have that much wire on them, so I'll probably make my own. But they don't have any interrupter on them. So I'm thinking about making a whole kit, like I said, of this stuff. I want to make, well, we'll talk about that later. Alright, this came off. Oh, I know it did. Alright, so let's look at this. And we're going to go, this is a 50,000 volt one. At 10 volts. So let's see what happens at 12 volts. So you can see that nice sparking, creating some nice ozone. Not much, but it's a pretty big streamer. But again, well, I can smell the ozone here. Let's look at everything I say after this is going to be not reliable because I'm smelling ozone. 24.9, so this is actually not drawing that much. And so you can see, because I don't have the capacitor in the right place, the instability of this. Now I can, what happens? It's still flickering a lot more than I want. Now, ideally, what I would do with this is extend the processes even more on the secondary. And that's what I mean is, what is that myself? On combination actually of switch 7, here's what we're doing here, but extending this out like switch number 5. And whereas this is, there's no transformer here like we're doing right now, we would extend this out across the secondary to another secondary, another transformer with a spark gap, and that would amplify the system even further. And that's what you got to understand by what I'm saying today. And Benitez wasn't trying to say one particular system is the only way to do it, but he was showing you different arrangements. So you, well, to get a patent, but obviously he's shown us how to do all that we need to do in this whole electrical generation system. So look at that right now. We have gone up to 25 point, it's fluctuating around, but you can see in this particular case, probably because I changed, let's look what happens when I move around the gap. Look at the gap change. When the gap changed, this is exactly a major point here. The batteries are showing lower voltage because we actually don't want sparking and arcing at all. We want to magnetically quench that, which he gets into the last patent. And so actually, if we actually run that to something particular, which we're not even doing here. See, I'm not even following, in this particular case, with the other ones, I was doing this. But with this one, this is just open right now. So really, even if I try to close it off, see, it doesn't work then. But once I go open up a little bit, I think I have a magnet here too that may be affected by it. I may be able to. Ow! Youch! I can't do it without getting too close enough to get zapped. Anyway, youch. 50,000 volts there. How's that for you? So again, we can play around with all this stuff and actually get the primary battery to stop discharging. So let's look at the voltages now. It's going to settle right now and go back up, as we can see, 25. But that's not, the object is not to show this battery charging, because that's the input battery. The object is showing, according to the patents, the charging batteries charging, which clearly they are, and over time we can look at that and see where it settles, so forth. Again, I said that in another video, but this is the only induction coil with interrupter I can find for sale anywhere online. And there's only so many of those left where I found them. Otherwise, you can do hit and miss with these other ones on eBay. So I'll just leave that voltage on there for now, and you can see. Let's go over now the switches individually. I don't have them all done at this point because I'm just starting this project. So there are eight what I'm now calling the Benitez Loving Paths Switches. So let that stick. Let that be from now on what this is called. Maybe. Not the Friedrich, because I didn't invent this, guys. People who thought that I was saying that I invented this is not. The Loving Paths name I invented. But this whole idea, I don't claim that I invented anything. I'm just passing on what I've learned. Ultimately, we all learn from heaven if it's good information. So all of these switches do the same sort of thing. That's the way you got to look at it. Look at the big picture. Look at the particular processes that do the same thing. This is what I'm trying to teach you in the end here. Because I want you to succeed, not for you to come back for more. I don't want to spoon feed and create that mentality. I want people to be independent. So, the first two are from the original 1914 17811 application, the patent application. Again, this is a British patent from Mexican Carlos F. Benitez. And so these two are shown in the same schematic. the dotted lines indicating this section is what I call the second switch. And they're only differing in that the second one has less parts and slightly different processes. Now, do not trust Patrick Kelly's drawing of this because he drops out the one wire, number 27. Now, obviously, Benitez knew what he was doing and he put that in there for a purpose. And you can actually understand why if you look at it and think about it, because supposedly the current is going in two different directions, so he gives two different paths for a reason. So I will draw this up in a way without this here. It's too hard to kind of look at in a more simplified way as I have in the next illustration here and all the other ones I've done. So we got switch number 1, and what's interesting about this particular patent is that the diodes here are going in a very unusual way. They're both going in the same direction off of the secondary of this coil, and this coil, and this one. So that's the only place I've ever seen anything like that in history. And this is a capacitor-based system. One capacitor within the rotation completely recharges itself while running bulbs or loads and the motor to spin the whole thing. This one is in oil, which it may be a little difficult for me to replicate this one. It's not the highest priority, so probably the last one that I replicate. It's still beneficial to understand these. Now, in this drawing, like I've said, these two are actually induction coils. They don't show the interrupter right here and right here, but they are there. And that's very important to know because otherwise you could make no sense of this. It would not do a single thing without the interrupter. Now he also calls it converters. And he says in the next patent application or edition, he talks about no need for converters to do it that way. So this one, interrupters there and there. Again, not shown in Patrick Kelly's schematic because he doesn't know about this technology really. Anyway, he says in every one of these patents and the additions that there is an excess of the original conditions thus being reestablished at every turn of cylinder 38. The same phenomena will be produced indefinitely as many times as the revolutions of the said cylinder are repeated without having recourse to any exterior aid. And that's what he says in every one of the patents. I'm not going to quote them all here. You can read them. I'm uploading them. And so let's move on to so this is switch number 1, switch number 2. Number 2 just makes it simplified with removing one of the transformers. And that's pretty much it. So that's switch number 1 and 2. The next two, which I call switch number 3 and 4, which I'm not showing for because I'm still drawing out the whole diagram of it. So the next two form the second edition. So the first edition was 5591, and the second edition now is 14311. And of the patent are only different in one of them having one less transformer capacitor spark gap from the other. Oh, sorry. I jumped ahead. This one is the first edition. Sorry, I jumped into the second edition. So the first one is 5591, the first addition to the patent is 5591, and they're only they're very closely identical to each other. Different several more parts and processes added to the one. I'll mention that in a second, but briefly, this is a purely capacitor and transformer system. No induction coil here, as he calls converters, which is another term used for them at the time. Now, what's really interesting is, I'm still analyzing this. I just transcribed the whole paper on this and uploaded it to my website. And what has to be noted here is on this cylindrical tube is what he calls exciters. And these are switches. And this is really important that you don't just understand these as basic switches. But he actually has, for example, two contacts on them, as you can see in here in this illustration. So when I have these as switches here in my diagram, understand that that's very limited in understanding the process. There's actually two contact points. And then switch number 4, which is expanded from this right here, and actually has one additional process in it. You can see when he makes a switch, he's actually throwing sometimes up to 3 or 4 switches at once. So all the contacts hit the exciter bus bar at the same time, instead of them individually switching together. So anyway, this will not work if you just hook up your capacitors. I was going to demonstrate it, but there's no point. You can do it yourself. Where you hook up all the capacitors and try and just touch a wire in place of the switches. It doesn't work. You need a frequency. The higher the frequency, the better. You need a rotation, which is actually driving this by the power that's generated from the system. He's driving a little motor to spin a cylindrical tube, and with contacts on it. So what happens is capacitor 1 charges up all 4 capacitors in a certain way, which we'll talk about in a minute, and then disconnects the source and never has to charge it again. Then he has a rearrangement of the capacitors in parallel, and they're in battery format. That means 2 capacitors in series becomes a battery. And then he discharges them not only across a transformer that recharges the capacitor, but also that puts out a load. Notice that the arrangement of the secondary is in series with the primary of the output transformer. Series batteries, series transformers. And the key is the disruptive discharge, not a constant current. Very critical. And of course this has to be all calibrated and all that. You don't want to have too much charging. And so forth. So that is the switch number 3. Now switch number 4, like I said, has 2 capacitors on the front end. Actually has a a little spark gap on number 13, which is not shown in this diagram. And then it has, instead of, this rotates with 2 phases. The fourth switch has 3 phases to the rotation. Click, click, click. Click, 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 click. Actually, this is 2 phases. Restores every time. And the other one has 1, 2, 3, 4. Sorry, it goes back to the 4th. No, sorry, 3, sorry. Anyway, so that's switch number 3, and we're going to get back to that one in a bit. See where our battery's at. So $11.99. Before this battery goes back, let's see. So you can see it's going to keep going back down, and then this is going to go back up. Under rest. 25.3. Now my last convention, I ran that motor there in the corner, and people there can write a comment if they are watching this video to confirm that they saw this. I ran that motor, and I actually filmed my lunch hour. It was still filming, so you can see that I never touched the batteries. And I ran it just the same way here with the motor in between. Plus I ran all the lights with the box, actually a clear box too. And of course the charging batteries charged. They were those 2 batteries in the corner here. I don't think the camera catches them, but they were charging and remained charged, while the input battery after lunchtime was higher than when I started loading the batteries down. Someone pointed that out to me, and that was pretty interesting. And maybe can you grab a voltmeter there? Actually, before we do this, I want to look at those voltages that we had over here. Because I haven't touched this since lunchtime. I want to see where these batteries were at.
On your negative spike and on your fats, are you getting this good a result there too? You are probably, right?
No, it's not as good as the trigger coil. It's it's the same kind of thing. So 1221. So these batteries were at, before I started the demonstration, they were in 11, somewhere in 11. And
right.
You know
that's a good rest.
And then 1229, this battery, I think that was in 11 here, but and then this one, see these voltages. So this one went down. Hold on a second. You know, I'm having this problem with these wires here. Yeah, see 25. 25.7, 25.6.
It started 25.5, you said, right? So it's actually higher than it was.
Yeah, so that's where I'm saying, so this is very important to understand that, and we could go back to that one a little bit later too, and we can see how the voltages will change over time. This is where, because of the negative spike, it's going back to the primary battery, and over time these batteries are going to charge. Now, we come back 2 days later, and it's past that point, and they're going to start going down, right? Or a day or whatever, depending on how much we use these batteries. But the energy's coming back and going back and forth. So essentially, these charged up while these were supposed to discharge. So this is now this is where it becomes a problem, guys. You've got so many batteries charging, and eventually you're going to have to discharge them. Because that is what we're after, unless we want it to be exactly the same. Actually, a battery that is constantly charging has to be discharged, so that may be inconvenient at some points. All right, so let's move on to the next 2 switches, 5 and 6. This is from the second edition of the patent, the first patent, and it's called 14311. and is differing only in one having one less transformer, capacitor, and spark gap from the other one. So he starts off with what I mentioned this already. So you've got the two batteries. This time we're changing from him using capacitors in the first two sets to now batteries. And he is running them 24 volts into 12 volts or whatever, double the voltage. And in fact, we get into the next one, which will be more than one battery bank, or 12, higher than, like tripling the input to the output, just as a variety of things that you can do. So in this one, switch number 5 and 6, starting off with switch number 5, is we're running induction coil with the capacitor across both positives. So the primary of the induction coil on one end and the secondary, actually both, in this one we've got a transformer and induction coil. So both primaries on one side are connected to the charging battery positive. And again, the two negatives are connected together. On the other side, we have both secondaries connected to each other. Sorry, never mind the secondaries yet. Both primaries connected to each other on the other side, and it goes through the interrupter. So we have a full make and break contact for both primaries, which is absolutely necessary, or you don't get this result at all. You can't do this with constant current. You will always have a loss in the batteries, charging from discharging, if it's just constant current. You'll have less of a discharge if you ran the load immediately across the batteries than if you shared the load, as I said before, but you still will have a loss. But with the make and break contact in with the feedback system, however you want to call it or look at it, you have then a gain, overall gain, which may even, as we said, charge up the primary battery at the same time if everything's done just right. Now, in this case, what we have just described is actually the same as switch number 6, which is simplistic, and the as he talks about, this one, the spark gap is in the interrupter. As you could see, I showed a couple of them, almost a greenish, bluish spark. And then this one, however, has both primaries and secondaries parallel to each other, except the secondary of this bottom transformer goes across a capacitor, and it doesn't connect directly to the wire. There's a spark gap between the secondary of this transformer and the connection with the other end of the capacitor and this secondary. So what happens is, I mean, this is as far as I understand, so these secondaries are powered through here, power goes through, and then that induces a current in the secondary, charges up this capacitor, and then sparks at a delayed time, out of phase, remember, to energize this coil, which then energizes this primary, which energizes that primary, and we've got a whole loop thing going around here. Not to mention, this is going to have a reciprocal effect upon itself. Between the coils, kind of bounces back and forth. You can see that on the oscilloscope. And all that happens on the off time. As soon as that induction coil is energized, the little interrupter will pull away. well, no, we'll pull towards it. And then there's immediate off time, which happens very fast, in which these coils can have a pretty much a standing wave for a bit. Anyway, this is a multiplication system. So this is a way of multiplying it out and gives you a major hint as he sort of gets into at the last patent, which is multiple spark gaps, people. Not many people will tell you that. And multiple, as I called, floating ground systems. Multiple tank circuits. So anyway, this one is the simplification of it. This is what I started showing, and then I ended up adding the extra transformer to drive it like number 7. So, all right, the third switch, part of the same second edition of the first patent, is very similar to both of those. It's very similar to both of these, but with different arrangements and advantages over both of the previous. That's why I went to this first. This was the easiest one for me to replicate initially, because I didn't have to deal with any spark gap, and I just had to take any induction coil and do this. Very easy to do, people. And then notice a couple things. First of all, again, the transformer is in series with the primary. So get that, people. Series. If supposedly current is going through one, it can go through others. Oh, but you got losses and resistance and... Don't worry about it. Not with this stuff. Just like I say, all the statements about batteries and cycling them doesn't apply to this technology. It doesn't apply to the right kind of pulse charging. The same way, we're gaining, we're not losing in all this system. So, notice series, 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 batteries, series, capacitors, series. Don't miss that out. Now, this one doesn't show it up here, but here's the original diagram. And you can see 3 cells to 3 cells. And you could arrange that where, say, all of these are parallel. So if this was 12 volts and this was 36 volts, you can do all that. And with my motors, you can do that too. Why not have 24 volts across the battery for a higher operating speed of the motor rather than just 12 volts, 2 batteries, whatever you want to do. These are easy systems, they just require batteries, or in that case, capacitors. So now, notice the other advantage here. Notice this little gap right here between the capacitor this time and it's not going directly to the battery terminal. It's going through this this coil here on the input. Notice also that the other end of the capacitor is going up to the negatives, between the negatives of the batteries. And I showed that in a previous video, actual demonstration of that when I disconnected it and I connected it. You could still put the, he talks about it in the patent, you could put the capacitor condenser, you know, remember points and condenser, across the gap. And that's where everybody has assumed over the years that the purpose of the condenser was just to stop the arcing across those point contacts. But he says that is actually only the secondary purpose of it. Primary purpose of it was to have a gain in the system. Now, he said also that you could, as long as you place the capacitor on one end of that point, on either side, and then you can connect the other end to somewhere else in the circuit. That is interesting to know. That shows you that you don't have to have it right across the terminals. So now you could, as I said earlier, combine these two together and have, for example, the additional transformer. And now I've done some experimentations with that, and you really have to have a suitable, if you're going to do this, for example, you have to match up all the parts. And so, for example, the primaries would have to be fairly similar, otherwise the current's going to flow through the one and not the other, or at different times. And all has to be balanced out. So this is only to do if you are familiar in this work and know what you're doing, and to get the secondaries just right and so forth. So anyway, that's the second edition, and the Benitez Loving Paths Switch 7, and then the last Benitez switch is in a patent all of its own, 122561, which is the best of all of them in terms of the least amount of parts, processes, and the greatest output, or COP. Oh, sorry. Holding the wrong one upside down. So now, there are several minor modifications of this, some of which result in major output differences. So let's look at this. This is very similar to Ed Gray copied this system fairly exactly and just added the motor, and then he used an inverter to boost up the voltage to 5,000 volts. But you can still see in Gray's system the two battery system. So you've got one, instead of four this time, you've got two, and one battery, which actually the load runs across the input battery. Very interesting. And like I said, some of this charging is going back to the load and to the battery itself. Otherwise, this really wouldn't function very well, in the sense that you'd have to change them pretty quickly. So that was a pleasant surprise to me to find that, because I was already doing this before I even looked at Bonita's stuff, and saw that on my motor, but I wasn't sure whether it would do it here, which it is. So now, again, you've got the interrupter here as one of the modifications, or he has a DC motor driving an AC generator, either case transformer action here to do higher voltage. But he's talking about 600 volts as a limitation of his diodes right here, so he's still not talking about high voltage compared to 50,000 volts I'm talking about. So again, we've got in this case, the capacitor is across the points, and the interrupter, and so you have the spark gap here is going through some magnetically quenching coils that blow out spark, so reduce it as much as possible, like I showed you when I ran this closer together. It was much more efficient than when I separated them. So now, what's critical in that, so there's two variations of this already. One, an induction coil, which is not stable, and so it's only a temporary thing. You really don't want to use an induction coil for any of this. To demonstrate it and look at it and play with it, yeah, but we need to get into something more suitable than that. But anyway, this magnetically quenched, like I said, an inverter with a spark gap is the end result, just like Gray did in the 1970s. So now what's interesting is, if you look at the Gray tube again, like we talked about before on this patent, the tube is at right angles to the gap, and that actually, the tube collected everything to power the motor. So the way I understand this is that these are not just creating a magnetic quench, but they're also collecting energy from the gap itself and kind of recycling the energy back and forth. And he talks about it in the patent, not too specifically, but that the points, it makes and breaks the contact with this arrangement. He does say you can use a regular spark gap in there, and so we'll probably show all the different combinations, because this is the most important patent. And but then what's interesting in this patent is he says that this capacitor is only 0.2 microfarads. 0.2 microfarads. So you think bigger, it's going to be more powerful. No, he says smaller and higher frequency. Again, high frequency is dangerous, and unless you know what you're doing, don't play with it. Even most of the people in this world who think they know what they're doing don't know what they're doing, so don't trust them. Oh, don't worry about it. It's not worth it, people. Put it in a box and protect yourself from the spark gaps. And be very careful when you try and do it higher power for many, many reasons. Ventilate if you create any kind of spark gap, otherwise you'll have ozone, you don't want to breathe that in. So anyway, it's simple. After that, it actually goes through this capacitor, again, through the capacitor. We're going to talk about the hairpin circuit in a minute. Going through the capacitor, and then through a rheostat, a potentiometer auto transformer action here. You can connect this top terminal back down to the other side for that, as he said. So I've tried it with and without. This is more or less regulating how much power you want to put out, because if you want to actually minimize it, you can actually change that adjustment, which is nice, because we don't want too much free energy. And then of course he's got these mercury rectifiers, as he called them, and he said that they were not essential to the process to have special mercury. I have to verify that yet. It's hard to find some of these old parts, especially if someone has some of these. I need the old Polson type of converter or magnetic quenching. I'd like to get an exact replication. Most of those are huge, the size of this whole room, for the big radio transmitters. But arc lamp is what I'm looking for right now. So anyway, he says as many times as you make and break the contact here of the spark, the gap, the more output you're going to get into the battery. And then, so he says, what would 0.2 microfarads amount to charge a battery? Nothing. You wouldn't touch a battery. Oh, we got your losses in the line. Well, you wouldn't even make it according to electron theory. It wouldn't do anything to that battery to charge it. But doing that, he says, millions of times, a million times a second or whatever, thousands of times a second, and his understanding charged the battery more. Now again, the theory of this is not important. Don't falter there, because if you do, you'll limit yourself in what you can expect. Let the evidence speak for itself to you. Let the facts dictate what the reality is. The point is that all the existing theories have mistakes in them, obvious mistakes that can't account for the known facts, especially when we look at this phenomena. And I personally don't, I believe that we will never have all the answers in this life, because in a way, we cannot have access to the spiritual world until we die. And so that is concealed from us, and it's going to be always a mystery. There will never be a meter to penetrate beyond somewhere where we can't. And of course, people have tried that. Nimrod tried to build a tower to the sky, and it was stopped. And so, no matter what you think, people, you'll never get there. And you don't have to. You don't have to know everything about all this. I mean, it's nice and convenient to have a theory, but we can have a practical theory. Under such circumstance, this happens without making up stories about fantasy fairy electrons that float around and do marvelous things. No insult to anybody there. I don't care if electrons exist or not. Okay, so with the several, let's see, am I done with this patent? Okay, so yeah, the several different modifications are induction coil or inverter here, spark gap or magnetically quenched spark gap, and then your output can go to a motor like Gray, a tube, and then we can combine what we've learned in these processes and add it more or less in here. So this is really what he left us with. There's nothing more needed in this system besides replacing the batteries altogether. So, while there are several optional arrangements mentioned in all these patent papers, they are not different enough for me to classify as additional switches in themselves. Benitez also mentions that those who are skilled in the art will readily see many implications and therefore combinations of these processes to be able to produce similar effects. So once you get it, what I've been saying all along is once you understand this whole idea of the floating ground and the using with disruptive discharge is essential, right? Once we understand these basic concepts, and especially as displayed in his patents, then you'll be able to see how you can multiply this out indefinitely. And so the capacitor never has to be recharged, the battery never has to be recharged, but one initial process can be multiplied out so that your neighbors can have your power, and their neighbors and their neighbors and their in a network. Just like Gabriel Cron had figured out and talked about. So, as part of the proposed Benitez open source project, I have begun transcribing the Benitez patents because the existing transcribed documents by Patrick Kelly have been radically changed from the original. Do not trust his work. He has deliberately changed words. He has added comments in there that distract you from the actual inventors. He has misrepresented them because he does not know this kind of technology at all. His entire misinforming presentation appears to be an attempt to divert people away from Benitez. If not, I'd like to know why all those things happen. And this is the document that everybody's looking at to look for free energy systems. I've been transcribing old American classics for free for from 25 years ago. until now. And truthandheart.com, you can see a whole bunch of them. Before the internet even started, I started doing that. Well, the internet as we know it today. I've just finished the second edition, 5591, of the patent, along with my diagram of the same Benitez Loving Paths Switch 3. The rest of them will be like this. I did do the couple of the other ones too. I'll be updating them as we actually demonstrate them with all the fine details over time. So I've just finished that and uploaded to the potentialtech.com website. Others will be done and added when time permits. What I propose to do is transcribe all the patents and create similar diagrams so that everyone can easily follow the details and progress of the patents. So from beginning to end, look at his progression as he presented it and all the particular details. I've also highlighted the key statements, already done that, and I haven't presented that yet, and we'll give illustrative details about them from others during that time. This is important because you can see he speaks within a context, not today's context, a different 100 years ago, according to the art at the time. So you got to understand there isn't really much more to know except what is an induction coil and a converter. Everything else is pretty straightforward. But it's interesting to see where others, like Tesla, have done similar processes, which we want to get into. In this video, I wish to do some of that with mentioning 2 papers by Tesla. We will then want to explore the different unique Benitez processes and seek to exploit and enlarge upon them. Finally, we want to seek the most efficient way to safely use readily available parts today to be able to use such systems practically. This is the number one goal of this whole open source project. In this open source project, I will try and demonstrate each of the 8 switches as close to their original form. I don't have any existing models or pictures of them or anything. If somebody has any of that detail, bring them out. I have somebody in Mexico looking to see if they can find anything about Benitez, old relatives or whatever. I don't have any information about him. That would be nice. I'll try and demonstrate in the original form as much as possible, and also to produce modifications of them so that we can readily replicate them with parts available today. The end result is to make one or two existing system that everyone in this world can make for themselves, that can produce 500 watts of power continuously for their needs, not their wants, their needs. And of course that could be modified for lower or higher power levels. But I'd like to see something where people could donate, not that the parts have to come through me or anything, but they could get parts out to people. Every household in this world could have it. Now, that's obviously idealistic, not going to happen, but it could be something, if we have an existing system, just like trying to get everybody solar panels. Well, solar panels are only good as long as there's sun, 1/3 or 1/4 of the day. They're not a complete solution. People need energy at night when there is no light, so forth. So something like this that is as cheap as possible, reliable as possible, safe, and readily available parts. And I ask, why hasn't this been done in the last 100 years, people? Come on. Of all the benevolent enterprises and giving all these poor people food, why not give them an energy source for once and for all, and let them grow their own food and whatever, produce their own power? Come on. I would like to have a suitable online forum for this. which is fundamentally different than the existing forums that mostly go nowhere, that are presently attacking me, but which are truly helpful to the most important things in history. Hold on, jumped a line there. That are truly helpful for the public. I'm not asking for anyone's help, and I have learned to accept that the most important things in history hardly ever get support from anyone. They never got support. That's the way it is. I can tell you, even the history of the Bible in English by Tyndale didn't get very much support. He did get support from Luther to get the Hebrew translated, but he had to slave away from it. The whole England forbid him to translate the Bible, so he had to go into the continent to translate it. Anyway, another subject. But I can tell you, very important discoveries and things have never been supported by anybody but one individual many times. All I ask is that you keep an open mind and be patient, and avoid falling for the traps of our subterfuge culture that elicits prejudice and bias and self-destruction. Keep yourself pure, people. So how can we benefit from understanding Bonita's patented process? From looking at two of Tesla's lectures mentioned already. Well, I want to look at what is called the Tesla hairpin circuit, or what he actually wanted to draw attention to, impedance phenomena under disruptive discharges. It's actually what it's labeled, and people are looking at it the wrong way, I think, a lot of times. So we also want to look at what is resonance, oscillation, vibration, which are different, impedance, and compare disruptive discharging with constant current. So let's look at the hairpin circuit, as it is called. I believe one of the first uses of the word hairpin in regards to a circuit was Ampere's hairpin. While these were related in that a hairpin was used as a bus bar looping the end of the circuit, just kind of like here. And while they have remotely been used to prove longitudinal waves, they are very unlike each other as much as constant current is to disruptive discharge. I'm not certain that Tesla invented the circuit, the hairpin circuit, at least the Tesla hairpin circuit. Some have said it is identical to Leacher lines in old radio systems. My point is not to get into these details, but rather to show the similarities of this to Benitez practical system. Notice in the third Benitez switch here, how the essential process shows the capacitors being charged from the secondary of transformer 5. So there's transformer 5, and I have it right here. So notice the arrangement of capacitors. It's a little bit harder to see here unless you know what the numbers mean, but you can see it outlined here. Notice the arrangement. This is similar to the hairpin circuit without a spark gap or load. Notice, you've got a coil. secondary here, secondary here, right? And you've got no spark gap in this case, but a spark gap here because you need to turn it on and off, right? You need a disruptive discharge. You can't just have a constant current flowing. It will not work. Now, he has the pulsing in the switch, on, off here. Same thing. So there's your spark gap, right? And then he's got the two capacitors here, and this doesn't make sense. That loop electronically does not make any sense. Here we have also, oops, here, notice the coil. Actually, all four capacitors are in series with each other in that way. So it's very similar to this. No one else has mentioned this that I'm aware of. That is very similar to the hairpin circuit right here. Except that he doesn't have any load here. And again, you could maybe add one there. The idea is to have the capacitors, the load themselves, and charge up so that you can circulate this around and charge up the initial capacitor and run another load. So, this will not work without some frequency to it, in the same way that the hairpin circuit cannot work without disruptive discharge. So let's now look at the last 5th, 6th, and 7th Benitez switches again. So again, here we have the 7th. So notice, what do you see on here? Why don't you pause the video and tell me where you see that kind of circuit in here? If you have, bravo. So the same kind of idea. Again, it's the idea. It's not the form of things, people. Think about the process. Not the name of it, not what quantum physics might call it or not call it or whatever. Think about the process in the real world, people. Not an imaginary world that doesn't exist. Let's look at, what do we have here? We've got a secondary going to batteries. Just as this system had capacitors, just like the hairpin circuit, capacitors, so you got to look at these batteries in a way, again, as the same sort of thing across the secondary. So really, again, the Bonita system is a genius way of doing a hairpin circuit. But what did Tesla tell us about it? The problem with Tesla in regards to free energy is he made very little reference to it and was ultimately commercially motivated and did not provide free energy to the world. People said he wanted to. A good question is, why didn't he? Why didn't the word Cliff Tower do more? Why didn't he make a smaller model and be content with that, or whatever? Tesla had his problems and was not such a good man that everybody makes him out to be. But Tesla did give us a lot of information that we can use to create these systems if you really read what he said. And he, again, liked these mysteries and left it for you to figure out. And when actually the establishment didn't bother to accept a lot of things, he didn't care either, by the sounds of it. But anyway, he doesn't say kind of anything to do with efficiency in the circuit or with most of the other things he says. He just says it has interesting results, curious things. And so if he had said, this bulb produces 100 watts of light with 50 watts input, everybody would be doing this right now. But the problem where people fail to generate, I watch these YouTube videos, even the #1 video that comes up, the guy, what's his name, in 2009, had 10 videos in one 10-part video. You could see his spark gap was not very good, and it didn't appear that he said, I'm not trying to demonstrate over unity, and I would say, why not? If you're going to go to the trouble and demonstrate it, like I just showed here, an actual demonstration, not that I'm trying to prove that it is over unity from a 5-minute run of the thing. I don't expect to insult your intelligence, but I did demonstrate it at my meetings enough that people could verify. Indeed, I did demonstrate over unity in that regards. Now, again, still very hard to evaluate a system based on batteries because you have to know the history of those batteries. And just going off of voltage isn't very reliable. But anyway, I show everybody how I do everything. There's nothing concealed. And even the box, you don't realize, but I didn't even conceal that, if you paid attention to everything I said. And some of you have called me up on the phone and I told you flat out what it is. You're like, oh, yeah, you already told me that in the video. So pay attention, people. I did reveal everything that you need to know. And especially with the Benitez system, there is nothing concealed from this whatsoever. So again, understand what Tesla is doing here, and understand, look at the diagram, the different brightness of the bulbs according to what he says, and different positioning. Remember, this isn't about free energy, this is about impedance, its relationship to this phenomena, which is very, very critical, which we need to get into, and we will. So yeah, I said the batteries are in place of the capacitors in the same way as the third and fourth switches are in the Bonita system, the hairpin circuit. Again, the idea of capacitors in that position makes for no ability to have a regular circuit here. It makes no sense. People scratch their heads about that with their theories. So I've found that both batteries can be in a state of charge in some of these setups, as I talked about earlier. So consider the unusual nature of the hairpin circuit with the capacitors electrically isolating the circuit loop, and the nature of the phenomena manifesting while running it. And consider also how this can charge up batteries the right way with the Bonita system, the right way, okay? Not all high pulsing is good for a battery. I know what is and what isn't good for a battery, a lead acid battery. So just because the battery's charging doesn't mean it's not ruining the battery in fast order. Remember that. Oh, I got it figured out, I got it! Oh, my batteries are no good anymore. That's what you gotta watch out for. So once this is understood, it can be multiplied out in similar ways. Notice also the series arrangements of the loads. Alright? Like I said, this is series. Capacitor, capacitor. The load is in series with the capacitor. Remember that. Series impedances. So this is what I've called the loving paths idea. Remember, sharing the load with the extra battery in the basic 0.1 instead of the flyback diode going upon the coil itself, you share the load with the battery. Now you're charging the battery, hopefully at the rate the other one's discharging. That's the loving path, as I call it, as opposed to a selfish circuit, which consumes it upon itself, right? And then going from there and adding a third battery bank, and you're running the motor between the two battery banks. This, again, is sharing the load, getting more output. Then, of course, adding a third stage process on the output to the charging battery, the main charging battery. And suddenly now we've got another output. And we can actually, with that, keep the primary input charged up and have no batteries discharge. And then we can multiply that process out again and again and again, which is a little bit harder to do. But once you understand this, everything I say in this video especially, you can do that, which is coming up shortly. The hairpin circuit has the charge, or whatever you call it, supposedly go through the capacitors in series to the various bulbs, where the shorted loop would normally prevent any circuit from functioning. So again, look at that. There's a copper bus bar, thick, stout bus bars. Any kind of regular electrical circuit, there'd be dead short. Boom. You'd heat up, these would become resistive, heating up, and there'd be no bulb here because this is the path of least resistance, right? So how can this, with more resistance than this, light up at all? Such as you would expect here, right? So, very interesting. The bulbs can be put under conductive water. Conductive, not distilled water, people. Salt water or whatever conductive water you want to use. And it can still run, no electrolysis. Which is what I showed with that motor, with my third stage process. With one of these bulbs in the water, no electrolysis, bulb still running. Not that the water is not going to damage the electronics inside of that bulb circuit, but I can run it without electrolysis is the point. And I can put my hand in it and not get a shock, right? And I can put voltmeter across and it registers 0 voltage. I can have even 0 amperage, 0 voltage AC, DC, 0 amperage, and yet still a waveform. So, what is the wave? I'm not saying that people can't mimic that with high voltage, whatever, but I'm not using high voltage, people. There is no high voltage in any of my systems so far. The highest that I'm doing is these, which are relatively low voltage too. So, explain that, people. And not high frequency either. I'm not working with very high frequency with that motor. It turns 4,000 RPM. What's that? You know, that's not very, very, very high. So, people show this with the water, the bulbs in the water, as though I had done with my third stage process. But what are the practical benefits we can get from this? Okay, we see these videos, we see these people lighting bulbs. What else, right? Can you run real loads? Can you really charge a battery at the same time? Can you keep the whole system running? We don't see that anywhere. I don't see any videos showing these kind of things, guys. Am I the only one? I know I'm not. I do know of a couple of videos. They have very low view count, and nobody knows about these videos. But they're, just like mine, very poorly done. And whatever. But the fake videos get all the hits. So, Benitez discharged the capacitors through transformers to recharge the primary capacitor while powering other loads. He did the same thing with batteries for bigger systems. So let us consider what Tesla wrote about this, and actually what he was bringing it up for an example of, this Tesla hairpin circuit, which he didn't call that. I'll go over the minute details of all these things in time as we go over each of the Benitez switches. This video is just an outline of what the proposed focus is to be. Just want to give you kind of heads up, this is the direction I want to go in, and if people want to get involved, let me know. Whatever, we'll see what we can do. We'll see how this goes. It may take years to do this because it's on my own free time and I don't have any extra time right now. So, I want to draw attention, before I read Tesla now, what I want to do is talk about the difference between, I noticed somebody who was talking about this on one of the forums, quoted Keeley, and he said that there's a difference between oscillation and vibration. So we want to make clear distinctions of words. Words are not so important to stumble over, but when people limit themselves to their vocabulary and don't define things properly, then they put themselves in a circle of ignorance. So notice what he said here, I like it. Oscillation is the rhythmically recurring translatory movement. Oscillation is a rhythmically recurring translatory movement, right? While vibration is the rhythmical motion of a body within itself. Itself, oscillation, reoccurring. It's different. In itself is a totally different concept. These two need to be distinguished and not used interchangeably. Not vague notions, people. Be precise. And before I go any further, here's a couple of diagrams of what we're going to talk about in Tesla's papers that I want to briefly go over. And the first one here is this Tesla hairpin circuit again. With motors actually running. There's the capacitors. It's pretty small to see. I'll put it up on the page. You can see a spark gap between center tap and primary and secondary, both sides of the circuit. Gone over that. So there's a lot of modifications of that. Then we see what we're going to talk about next is the one wire. So you've got a high disruptive discharge here, high frequency, and you've got one wire transmission. And everything you really want to know about Tesla is in these two papers. All the seeds of all the good stuff that he talked about, which is quite overlooked in my opinion. Everybody wants to go to the wireless, but the one wire details are pretty important when you consider especially this plate that we're going to talk about here. So here you have again going through one wire, basic motor coil, going to a plate, and then this disc that spins here. And this tells you a lot of what I'm doing, what Benitez is doing, and look at this transmission line here, and look at what he can run off of just one wire, not just the bulb, people, but transformers and any type of load. So you can see this little here is kind of illustrative of what's going down here the same way, but with a closed secondary and primary together, and then you have this alternative. So there's a lot of different modifications. These are just a few samples. So now let's go into the lectures. So I have a file that was published in 1894 And that was in the Electrical Engineer in New York. And this time I need my glasses. And it's actually in a chapter 27. Experiments with alternate currents of high potential and high frequency. So this is the first lecture from 1892, published here in 1894. And the next one that we'll look at is a continuation of that. Most of the important things are in this lecture. Now I'm going to go down. I'm not going to give you page numbers here, but I will quote it and you can do a search in your browser or wherever you're going to find this file. I put the link up on the website where you get it, and you can find the places where I read here. So I'm not going to read through the whole thing. We don't have the time. My videos are too long and boring, I'm told. So I'm not going to make it too long here. But I want to say a few things. Some of you appreciate these videos, and so I'm doing it for you. I'm also saying this because I may be wrong and somebody could correct me, and that's great. I have everything to learn. Okay, so what he says on page 233, okay, so I did put the page numbers here. A most curious feature of alternate currents of high frequencies and potential is that they enable us to perform many experiments by the use of one wire only. In many respects, this feature is of great interest. He goes in this and that, whatever. Shows that first diagram here. That's figure 146. So I'm just going to brush through here and decide what to say and what not to say. What I want to do is keep a focus on the main points, some very interesting things that he says, and focus on the Bonita system, because all this essentially is hard for the person not skilled in this to really make sense of without the Bonita system fully illustrating these points. And is a great learning tool to learn off of, because if we don't really see something that Tesla made, what he's referring to, which was actually demonstrated before these people back 100 years ago, it's hard for us to really fully comprehend with the passage of more than 130 years, or 120 years now. Okay, one comment he says is, once it is decided to use very high frequencies, the return wire becomes unnecessary, and all the appliances are simplified. By the use of obvious means, the same result is obtained as through the return wire were used. It is sufficient for this purpose to bring in contact with the bulb, or merely in the vicinity of the same, an insulated body of some surface. This is this plate and so forth, which you could use a battery. Now that is pertaining to the next set of diagrams here, again with the plate P, 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 not shown in those, but shown right here, extending. Because this plate actually becomes a terminal endpoint. Again, the loving path system, it goes through the load to a destination. And that way, it also, at the end of this plate, can receive, it's kind of like two different poles, right? It can receive a signal, it can be charged and have its own charge, and so you operate between potentials So he says when energy is absorbed in a condenser, a capacitor, the same behaves as though its capacity were increased. Absorption always exists, more or less, but generally it is small and of no consequence as long as the frequencies are not very great. So this is in a specific context here, but I want you to understand that that's how this is improved on the higher frequency. Benitez says that throughout. All our experience show that. I show actually you don't really need really high frequencies to have high outputs with my system, which is actually great because then you don't have to worry about shielding against it and all that. But the quick, fast way of doing it is the high frequencies. So the condenser, the capacitor, by itself, with constant current, is a big loss. You know, you lose half the energy. But as soon as you have a very good quality capacitor, like photo flash, ultra capacitors, very well made capacitors, non-leaky capacitors, and you're rapidly doing what the Tesla switch supposedly was called does, then you can actually benefit from that. So he says here, just a quick quote, I will avail myself principally of such as are producible without any return circuit, hoping to interest you the more by presenting these phenomena in a more or less novel aspect. So he's saying more or less novel because he did not discover these things on his own. He saw what other people were doing and jumped on it and did promote these things, which was needed to do. So, it has been a long time customary, so this is 1892, a long time, still relatively new, electrical operations, but he says a long time customary, owing to the limited experience with vibratory circuits, or currents, to consider an electric current as something circulating in a closed conducting path. Right? Closed loop. It was astonishing at first to realize that any current may flow through the conducting path, even if the latter be interrupted. And it was still more surprising to learn that sometimes it may be even easier to make a current flow under such conditions than through a closed path. But that old idea is gradually disappearing. Sorry, Tesla, it has just, your idea has long been forgotten. People are all the more firm in their closed path systems. He says it's gradually disappearing even among practical men. There's that word. And soon will be entirely forgotten. Okay, people, practical. That's what I've been saying all along. That's what I'm saying today. That's what this man was saying. What's more practical? Waiting for the current to flow down the line and have all your line losses? Or one wire, rapid pulsing, disrupt, full make and break. Oh, but then we'd have to change all of our appliances. Well, let's get rid of the transmission wires. We're not get rid of them. Let's get rid of the systems that transmit. Let's add another process and then receive it down the line. Oh, the problem with that is you could probably just tap into the wire and no one would ever know that you did do that. Ah, that's why we use constant current in our electrical transmission, people. Because if you did, you couldn't regulate it. If you didn't do that, if you did do the disrupted discharge. So that's why we have the low frequency on the lines. That's why it's constant current. And that's why you pay your energy bill. So he shows image here, which I'm not going to show you. Figure 175. If I connect an insulating plate to one of the terminals of the induction coil by means of a wire through this plate, though this plate be very well insulated, a current passes through the wire when the coil is set to work. First, I wish to give you evidence that there is a current passing through the connecting wire. Blah, 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 blah. I'm not going to get into all this. It's a little bit too involved. But it just shows more of these kind of illustrations here. And he describes them in detail. And he describes, for example, bulbs lighting up as the terminal point at the end of the one wire, and then having it go on to a plate, and the light lights up brighter, as in, well, I might show that picture in a minute. So he's just going over the benefits, what can be done. So here's the image that I was talking about. So when the bulb is terminating, the terminating point, as opposed to the plate, the bulb is brighter when the point is the terminating point, which would make no sense when you think about it. And of course, then there is also matters of impedance matching, which he's going to get into when we get to that point. All right, so he said, still another feature of some interest I may here bring to your attention. When the insulating plate is disconnected and the secondary of the coil opened, by approaching a small object to the secondary, but very small sparks can be drawn from it, showing that the electrostatic induction is small in this case. But upon the secondary being closed upon itself, or through the lamp, the filament glowing brightly, strong sparks are obtained from the secondary. The electrostatic induction is now much greater because the closed secondary determines the greater flow of current through the primary, principally through that half of it which is connected to the induction coil. Now I was doing something like that with this. When I brought this out, it behaved much differently. When I actually cut it right off and shorted it upon itself, it also. So these things can be seen. You can look at them yourself. And so forth. So there's a lot of details in here about one wire that are really, really important to what we're doing. But I don't want to overwhelm you to say you have to understand every aspect of them. Take what you can and try and hear what I'm saying today, because it really is not that big of a deal. When you actually focus in on what is important and forget about what's not important, you know, keep the two separated. That's what the problem with all these groups are, is essentially people are deliberate trolls, or might as well be trolls, because they overwhelm you with so much information, and everybody's saying this is important, but only listen to somebody who actually shows you something that works. Those are the people that you need to listen to say this is important. Okay, I'll pay attention there. But all these people coming in saying this and that, and you go off on these wild goose chases, and all you're doing is perfecting an unessential aspect, getting a little bit more efficiency out. That's not what you need to do, people. Now here is an interesting, this is what I want to directly get into in this paper. Very high frequencies are of course not practicable with motors on account of the necessity of employing iron cores, right? But one may use sudden discharges of low frequency and thus obtain certain advantages of high frequency currents without rendering the iron core entirely incapable of following the changes and without entailing a very great expenditure of energy in the core. Ta-da! That's exactly what I'm doing in my motors, people. Exactly. So we can still use low frequency with the disruptive discharge and get the same benefits of the high frequency, right? So it's not the frequency, as we're going to see here, that's everything. It's a quick and easy way to do it, but it may not always be easy to do that. You know, I mean this, well that's high voltage, not high frequency. So now, so he says, I have found it quite practicable to operate with such low frequency disruptive discharges of condensers, alternating current motors. It might not be without interest to show an experiment with a simple motor of this kind, inasmuch as it is commonly thought that disruptive discharges are unsuitable for such purposes. But it is not true. Now he says here, he ends with, jumping ahead here, by observing certain elementary rules, I have also found it practicable to operate ordinary series or shunt direct current motors with such disruptive discharges, and this can be done with or without a return wire. So again, don't limit yourself to the hairpin circuit. This was just talking about impedance. You could still run the same thing, the capacitor there and the line out, and you can do all sorts of things like that. Like think of where my box is located. Think about that in my circuit. Impedance phenomena. Here we go. This is one of the points I want to definitely touch on today. Among the various current phenomena observed, perhaps the most interesting are those of impedance presented by conductors of currents varying at a rapid rate. Here we go. In my first paper before the American Institute of Electrical Engineers, I described a few striking observations of this kind. Thus I showed that when such currents of sudden discharges are passed through a thick mill bar, there may be points on the bar only a few inches apart which have a sufficient potential difference between them to maintain a bright incandescence of an ordinary filament lamp. Okay? So across one wire or a block, you can do that. That's easy to show. I'll show that one day. Remind me. I have also described the curious behavior of rarefied gas surrounding a conductor due to such sudden rushes of current. So I've shown you that for the last years, neon bulb lighting up in the presence of one of my machines on plastic, on wood. All I had to do is touch the wood, plastic. Sometimes even just being in the area, the neon bulb will light up. Okay, big deal, neon bulb, it's not practical. It's not going to really help you even go to the bathroom at midnight and see where you're going. So we need to get beyond that, people trying to describe this stuff. You need to really illustrate it with real working systems. Now, we're going to come to this point. Figures 183 A, B, and C. Two other experiments are illustrated which, unlike the previous experiment, do not require placed in certain positions as indicated. He just goes into the details of how this all works and how there's different arrangements. Okay, these results, as I have pointed out previously, should not be considered to be due exactly to frequency, but rather to time, to the time rate of change, right? The impedance, the rate of change that it can be affected and it can respond. Those are two different things right there. Its rate of change, the reaction time and its reaction time. So, it's not about the frequency, it's about the frequency of the object, right? Its reaction time to the frequency, so forth. So those are different aspects of time that are very important, different periods of rest, as I've talked about. A great many other results of the same kind, equally interesting, especially to those who are only used to manipulate steady currents, may be obtained and therefore afford precious clues in investigating the nature of electric currents. So, in the preceding experiments, I've already had occasion to show some light phenomena, and it would now be proper to study these in particular. But to make investigation more complete, we need to talk about resonance. So, this is very important again. I talked about this before. So he says, it is clear that if we succeed in employing the effects of resonance practically in the operation of electric devices, the return wire will, a matter of course, become unnecessary, for the electric vibration may be conveyed with one wire just as well, and sometimes even better than with two. So again, the one wire, how do you do it? Resonance. But the question first to answer is then whether pure resonance effects are producible. See, people always talk about resonance, but they err in their assumptions. You think either you have it or you don't. But you don't have it, otherwise it will self-destruct. And there is no such thing, as he says here. The theory and experiment both show that such is impossible in nature, for as the oscillations become more and more vigorous, the losses in the vibrating bodies and environmenting media rapidly increase and necessarily check the vibration, which otherwise would go on increasing forever. There's the definition again implied that Keeley talked about. Vibration is the object itself vibrating, not this and something else, it's itself vibrating. Oscillation is putting it through, repeating a process, different. So, if the vibration is occurring more and more rapidly, which pure resonance would cause, it would self-destruct. But nothing is in a vacuum. Therefore, everything around it dampens it. And so it actually goes down, unless, of course, the input into it is so powerful that it does self-destruct. It is fortunate circumstance that pure resonance is not producible, for if it were, there's no telling what dangers might not lie in wait for the innocent experimenter. Let's hold Tesla to his words and say that the Tesla coil itself is not innocent, and it's unfortunate that he gave it to us, because there's untold dangers that await all those who are playing with it as if it is a toy, and which could cause serious damage biologically and actually cause things to go into pure resonance and self-destruct. But that, again, is another video that I talked about. So, to a certain degree, resonance is producible, the magnitude of the effects being limited by the imperfect conductivity and imperfect elasticity of the media, or generally stated, by frictional losses. The smaller these losses, the more striking are the effects. The same is the case in mechanical vibration. A stout steel bar may be set in vibration by drops of water falling upon it at proper intervals. And it's not just, guys, it's not just how much the frequency, but it's the length of the on time. Pulse and width are a factor in your creating resonance, and magnitude as well, if I'm using the right words. So this bar can be set in vibration by drops of water falling at the proper intervals, and with a glass which is more perfect elastic, the resonant effects is still more remarkable. For a goblet may be burst by singing into it a note of the proper pitch. The electrical resonance is more perfectly attained. The smaller the resistance or the impedance of the conducting path, and the more perfect the dielectric. So again, what you want, okay, here's another secret. On the output of my systems is big copper bars. You might have seen that in times past. Big copper bars, just like the big stout bars right here, right? Not that we're trying to absolutely minimize resistance on a conventional level, but something else is taking place here. Anyway, perfect conducting path, so forth. It is the same as in conventional circuitry, but far greater. That's why bigger batteries are going to charge up more quicker, or produce more total charge than smaller batteries. He talks about tuning forks immersed in mercury vibration. Self-induction can be overcome by combining it with capacity. If the relation between these is such that at the frequency used they annul each other, that is, have such values as to satisfy the condition of resonance, and the greatest quantity of electricity is made to flow through the external circuit, then the best result is obtained. So again, all these things, what I want to say is, get practical now. So, how do we do my third stage process? How do we enhance the Benitez system? Is, like I just said, thicker output wires where it is important. Now, some have made a great big deal about not turning angles and all that. This is when you start getting into real specifics and making round turns and so forth. But what we want to do is create, paying attention to impedance, the response time, okay, on any particular system, and realizing a capacitor is not a capacitor. There's a difference between two capacitors, one electrolytic, regular, one a photo flash capacitor, which can respond much quicker. We want the quicker one. Transformers, we want better core material. You can see here there's laminations. The more laminations, the less loss and eddy currents on a conventional level. But we want ideally zero delay, which has been done, by the way. Transformer cores have been made. And we want to look at those things and create higher resonance at that point here. But then there's a matching with the load that you're running, which can be, what I'm trying to do is make this as simple as possible to give you a feel. An inductor transformer can be regulated with adjustable capacitors and resistive loads or resistors as well, which is the same thing as all applies in a tank circuit. So ideally with my motors, we create resonance in the motor coil itself as much as possible, even though you have an iron core. And then we actually create resonance. That's not as important as creating resonance in any output. And then we can multiply that out. If we have a pure resonance in that output, we can multiply that output again and again and again. And so that's where we get into these induction coils and capacitors and resistances and different types of arrangements with spark gaps and all that to either multiply itself out or get into a state of purer resonance. And then we can actually act as if something is in pure resonance, it would be like in these kinds of disruptive discharges, it would be like it wasn't even there in the sense of its resistance. So that's where, I'm speaking generally here, that's where we want to maximize that in the higher outputs, and where we can actually get into the system maintaining its own charge, like Gabriel Cron said, and being able to remove the input altogether, just as Benitez showed you how to do right here. So again, to put something in resonance, you have to consider its impedance, its response time to what you're doing to it, striking it with a particular object, how hard, how frequently, or electrically, what does it respond to? Your heart, it stopped, how are we going to get it going again? Oh, you know, what's the impedance of your heart? Oh, that would be a good spiritual analogy, wouldn't it? What's the impedance? I think I already made that analogy. What's the impedance of your heart? How fast does it respond to the truth? Ooh, that's good, that's good. All right. Yeah. So the impedance, on my list, resonance and impedance go hand in hand, but only with disruptive discharge. Again, constant current it's always running, there's no make or break. There's once to start and once to finish, but it's all death, people. Destructive circuits, as I said before. Disruptive discharge is the way of nature of creation of all of living organisms. Pulse, make and break. Without it, there is no free energy in that normal or the electrical sense of the term. Then you have, like I said, the difference between vibration and oscillation. Oscillations are reoccurring, starting, vibration is the object itself. Alright, so then there might be a few more words here. He talks about the welfare of all and how important it is. that we move in this direction into actually into wireless altogether. So we're at 1178 on these batteries from what they were before. Forget what it was. That probably, I think it was something like 1160 something, whatever. And again, we're at 25.3. 5 minutes is not going to show you really any indication of how it works, you know, over time. But I think I pretty much covered everything I wanted to do. This is the Benitez project, I said, open source, and it will go hand in hand with my motor kits. It will be like an add-on to the kits, and like I said, we'll try and make parts available for that, even assembled systems eventually, and you won't have to use these induction coils to do it. We'll make it so that it works easier. There are other improved ways that you don't have to have the interrupter the way it's shown with a piece of steel bending back and forth. So we want parts that don't wear out. We want them practical, affordable, easy to make, and safe. So again, you have to be safe. That's why I did that zinc box somewhere around here where you put, let me just show it for those who haven't seen the other video. Dragging it around everywhere here. So I just put zinc and some wood, seal it all up, and then run your high frequency systems inside of that. I will have another additional process to that to also tap into the energy that is sent outward and capture that too. So there's a lot that can be done, people. As long as you understand the basics of this system, you have a source, and then you create a storage of that source, and then once you disrupt that source from a receiver, such as a coil or another capacitor or battery of some sort, then you can then from there multiply it out, as I showed here, and then send some of the energy back to the secondary source, not the primary. You don't have to send it back to the original source. And then you can run your load and just keep repeating that. So in one way or another we can do that, and you just have to understand the basics of that. You have to throw away all the limitations of constant current electronics, and you have to then look at the other half. And like I said before, when you think about the electronics teaching, I mean, how many engineers have called me up and said, I wasn't taught this at school. I said, you know what? You actually were. But what they did to you was they went over it so quickly, just like in the medical world, talk about prevention this much, just because we have to cover it, right? A few sentences maybe. So in this way, here you have electrical phenomena, constant current, disruptive discharge. They're really one's half and this is the other half, right, of the potential possibilities. So what we've done in our schools is say, we'll give you a paragraph about negative resistance, for example, and one little example of the op-amp op-amp circuit. Oh look, it shows negative resistance. Oh wow, that's curious. But it's only curious. It's an abnormality. Why? Because we're using constant current always. But like I said before, if we had just looked at creation and looked at the birds in the air and saw how their wings were shaped and just how they were flying, we may have been able to fly a lot earlier. In the same way, why don't we look biologically and see how our bodies operate not by constant current and say, well, maybe that's more efficient. Maybe because the human body is far more efficient than any machine ever conceivable. Well, why? So let's look at those things, realize, so the engineers, I tell you, they have talked about some of these things as if they're not practical. And they are. They are. They can do all the same things and far better. And so I may not be the best teacher in this. I have been able to make all this work myself for years and without any degrees in this at all. So I ask those who are supposedly the teachers, why on earth are you not making this plain and simple and demonstrating it and using it and, you know, start making products? Go make them. Hey, I'll sell your products if you can make them. Whatever. Make them. Don't talk the talk anymore. And you, the listener, don't put up with it. People, if they are claiming to have something, prove it. You know, skeptics certainly want to know. And I've shown this for 13 years to skeptics all around the country. And nobody's ever been able to. I remember one guy in Germany just suddenly, I mean, Germans can be really controlled, suddenly blew up. Ah! They stormed out of the room and ran out of the room. He couldn't take it because everything he had been taught was the opposite of this. And, you know, but I've never had somebody say, it doesn't work, look, and show me something that's not working. Never. So don't put up with it. Insist upon that method, simplicity, safe. Where are the people calling for safety? Hardly anybody. Practical systems. Let's get away from all this math that may not even be real. And who cares what you can say or show some arcs and sparks, people? Who cares about this spark and how big is your gap? You know, actually the smaller the better, people. The smaller the gap there. As small as you can make it. And then, so these are the things. I'm just trying to say the basics, the things that you want to focus on, things you want to avoid, something that hurts you, something that will kill your batteries if you're using batteries. You know, you want low impedance, resonance as much as possible, and the right phasing. If you have current supposedly flowing in one direction, you don't want to flow against it. So these are all the things that I'm just going to keep repeating one way or another in illustrating. But really that's it. There isn't really much more to know about any of this stuff. And again, I'm surprised that I don't see people, 100 years have passed. And Bonita's system is so clearly laid out. Anybody can take an induction coil and some batteries and done this. Come on. Am I the first one to actually show this? The first one? In 100 years? That's crazy. So, let's see some more people, man. Stand up, do something. And let's forget about all this chit-chat and get to work. And do some work, people. And back up your words if you have them with action. Thank you for watching.